Stay up to date on the latest political news this election season for less. Visit inforum.news/port and get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Subscribe now at inforum.news/port. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Forum Communications Company is proud to be a part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org. Welcome to another episode of Plain Talk. Happy to be with you. And joining this episode, of course, is my Wednesday co-host, Chad Oban. And in addition is Mark Haugen, who is running for the United States House of Representatives on the Democratic-NPL ticket. Well, I guess you're still campaigning. No, you're not. The primary's over. What am I even talking about? I don't know where I'm at. The general election has commenced, and Mark Haugen is now the nominee. I don't know why I was going back. I am just
that the week of vacation really threw you off.
It
Rob.
really,
My God.
it really.
For how much we've talked about the primary in the last couple of months, you'd think you'd recall it.
I think I would. I tell you what, though, I had a very stressful 4-game series by Yankees against the Astros that I felt like I needed another vacation after. That was rough. Anyway, we're gonna get right to it. Mark, welcome to the program. How you doing?
Very well. Thank you, Rob and Chad, for letting me join you.
You've been out on the campaign trail doing all that stuff, working hard. But you had an EMS fundraising event you were telling me about before we started the interview. Tell me a little bit more about that. You've been involved in that for a long time.
Yes, I've been in EMS since 1985 with the Garrison Ambulance Service as a volunteer, and I took on leadership positions. I even lobbied in the legislature for EMS, and the fruits of the work over those years have paid off in great state support for our volunteers and our paid staff throughout North Dakota. And now I take on the role. For several years, I've been in a role with the North Dakota EMS Foundation, where we provide dollars for scholarships for EMT students, paramedic students, and then support education workshops throughout North Dakota. We got to raise the money, and so we were developing relationships with benefactors out there. And then we have two main fundraisers, and that's the Dale Severson Memorial Golf Scramble. Dale was a long-time legislator, not a long time, but for a couple of terms, a legislator from Cooperstown. And then the Tom Nearing Memorial Fishing Tournament coming up in August at Van Hook near Newtown. Tom Nearing was the first paramedic in North Dakota back in the 1980s, and was kind of the Dale Severson and Tom Nearing, one of the founders of EMS. Back in the early days in the 1970s and 1980s. So I'm happy to play that role to try to do our best to support our young up-and-coming EMTs and paramedics throughout North Dakota. So thank you for letting me tell you a little bit about that.
So, Mark, running for Congress in 2022 is a unique thing. I just think about the last week or so with guns, with the Supreme Court, with January 6th. As I was thinking about this interview, I was trying to figure out where the heck to start because there's so much going on. I'm going to start with guns. The president signed a bipartisan compromise to do some work to get guns out of the hands of people who have mental illness or other things, incentivizing red flag bills, beefing up the background checks for people between the ages of 18 and 21. None of the members of the North Dakota congressional delegation voted for those bipartisan pieces of legislation. It felt, frankly, like none of the three were even open to the idea. I know you're not running against Kevin Cramer, but he said people are more concerned about the red wave, referring to Republicans winning this November, than they are about red flags. How would you have approached the work that was done on this? I mean, it's not a huge jump, but I think it will be significant, hopefully, in helping keep guns out of the hands of people that are unwell. Where would you have been on that bill? How would you have approached it?
Thank you, Chad, for that question. The provision that really, struck me was the boyfriend provision. I'm a Second Amendment supporter. I'm from Western North Dakota, in between Parshall and Garrison. So, I support the Second Amendment. So I'm a little bit. I know I probably I believe there's Second Amendment Democrats that are out there that that really have believe in hunting and the Second Amendment and what it means for this country. But that one for me, I would support. And I realize the red flag laws, really kind of create some templates for the states to consider and that type of thing, which is kind of just a small step. But I think I would have been on that bipartisan group that would have helped push this through. So, although I believe in hunting, I believe in the Second Amendment. I think these are good small steps. I know many Democrats in Congress would want us to go a lot further, but you got to take these baby steps at some time. That's
in his statement. Your opponent, incumbent Kelly Armstrong, in his statement explaining his no vote on that bill, he brought up, and he actually brought this up during an interview I had with him as well, and he said that he was very concerned. And it's a difficult issue because he said, he wants, for especially for background checks for people under the age of 21, that we should be able to include juvenile records in that process, right? It's not like when it comes to buying a gun, when you turn 18, the way the law works is anything you may have done when you were below 18 is basically hidden from public record. It can't be held against you in court. And so he wanted to include that, but he didn't like the way that the bill ultimately did that. And he said essentially this sort of does away with or already erodes that protection, that very important protection for juvenile criminal records. Can you speak to that? And obviously Kelly, he's a defense lawyer. He's worked in criminal law in the past. Can you react to his reasoning for his vote on that?
I guess I would tend to agree with Representative Armstrong that it gets to be a delicate issue when you open up these juvenile records. And so on first blush, you got to think long and hard about going down that road because there's a reason why that juvenile records are protected. Again, these are young people that simply make a mistake in life. And we're talking about guns here, so that's a different issue. I guess maybe we just didn't have the time to really debate that issue, really research that issue. So I would have some concerns too to open up these juvenile records for these children.
Yeah. So moving on to another big issue of the day, and that is what happened yesterday at the January 6th committee meeting, the surprise meeting where Cassidy Hutchinson testified about what was happening behind the scenes on January 6th and the days leading up to it. What was your take on what we saw from Cassidy Hutchinson yesterday? I'd like to say I'm no longer surprised at stuff we're learning here, but it just seems to keep getting worse and worse and worse. The folks asking for pardons, the information of, how Trump's I don't know where his head was at throughout this stuff and the tantrums and that kind of thing. So what was your take after the committee hearing yesterday?
What a strong, lady that stepped forward. I think she's in her mid-20s,
25.
25 to assistant to the Mark Meadows, I believe. Hutchinson is her name. Very courageous. And those are the type of people that when we look back on Watergate and John Dean, or we look at what's happening now recently with these hearings, these are the young people that step forward and say, this is wrong. And they speak power. They speak the truth. And good job, Miss Hutchinson, for what you did. And she'll be honored, I think, in this country for a long time for what she did. And I think we're going to see I would hope that we see people that have been Trump supporters kind of temper themselves a little bit as we move forward. I'm really concerned about the future regarding with the events of January 6th. I think we need men and women in Congress that are serious about our democracy, that love the rule of law, love our Constitution, love our traditions, and stick to those traditions. We were very, very, very close to losing our democracy, and I think moving forward, there's some concerns, and that's why another reason why I'm running for Congress.
Hey, Rob, can I jump in with a follow-up before I give it back to you?
Sure.
So prior to January 6th, there was a rally at the state capitol, the Stop the Steal rally, that your opponent, along with Senator Haugen and Senator Kramer, participated in. It was largely peaceful. I think there was one fist fight. But in today's day and age, one fist fight, not a big deal. Do you think Kelly and the two senators hold some, I don't want to say blame, but were they part of the problem leading up to January 6th by participating in events like that were insinuating or saying that they had concerns about the election being stolen?
I think there was some, they're going down that avenue. They talked a good talk, but can they walk the walk when it comes to, saving our believe in our democracy and our traditions? They're pandering to a base, but I know that my opponent came forward with a statement saying what happened on January 6th is wrong, or what happened in the attempt on January 6th to obviously throw the electoral college into disarray, into chaos, was wrong. And I saw that statement, read that statement. I will give him credit for making that type of statement, but in the same token, again, the rally shows that they were there trying to get that base riled up, and I guess we'll kind of see what kind of as we move forward. Maybe I'm focusing on 2022, but when we move into 2024, how that changes.
I can't put words in the mouths of Congressman Kramer or excuse me, Senator Kramer, Senator Haugen, or Congressman Armstrong. I do think that there's a lot of pandering going on. There's a lot of, I think there was a feeling pre-January 6th that I'm hoping has evaporated somewhat, but it's just like, we're going to go out, we're just going to give the people red meat, and it doesn't really matter. And I think what January 6th proved is it does matter. And that brings me to another thing that we're going through right now. The U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision in Dobbs regarding abortion. And right now we're hearing people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, if you were elected, Mark, would be your colleague in the House. She's out there saying the Supreme Court's illegitimate. We have people saying, Maxine Waters is out there saying, we don't care what the Supreme Court says. To me, I don't perceive that as being all that different than Trumpists saying the Electoral College doesn't matter, the vote doesn't matter, we didn't get our way, so now we're going to throw a fit about it. And I think while we haven't seen, obviously, an insurrection at the National Capitol, we've certainly seen violence at, like, the state capitol in Arkansas. We've seen attempted violence outside of the homes of some of the Supreme Court justices, including somebody who was arrested with weapons, who was outside of Brett Kavanaugh's home, looking for assassination. It worries me, that sort of rhetoric. And we could get in for a moment how we all feel about the Supreme Court's opinion. But Mark, does it worry you? Because what you were just saying, having respect for our traditions and everything, I've been saying that for a long time. Part of living in this society means accepting the outcomes that our institutions produce, whether it's an election, whether it's a legislature, whether it's a court. It means accepting those even when we don't necessarily like them, as opposed to saying, I'm going to blow up the system because I don't like this. I think that's very dangerous, and it seems like everybody's very, very casual talking that way these days, right and left, and I'm wondering how you feel about it.
Thank you for the question, Rob. Elections have consequences, and that's a catch term. I think a lot of people use, but it's the truth. Trump appointed three justices to the Supreme Court, and those are the consequences. I went back. I went back into my thought process, my history. I entered politics in 1980. I listened to Senator Quentin Burdick at the Fargo Convention in my first convention, and I voted for Jimmy Carter. Actually, I voted for Senator Edward Kennedy at the convention for president. Of course, he lost to Jimmy Carter in 1980, and I voted for Carter, and I voted for every Democratic president, and including Joe Biden. And there's consequences with that. And yes, I became pro-life later as an adult, but as it got important to me in my life. But I still voted for that Democratic president because I felt that that president could lead through policy that can reduce abortions. And so that was very, very, very important to me. So thank you for letting me just kind of bring that in. But I know that for example, Jimmy Carter and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whether it's President Obama, whether it's Joe Biden, those are justices he chose, and I respect that. But because there's different, I was going at this pro-life issue a little bit differently. But again, elections have consequences. There's no doubt about that.
So I think diving a little bit into that decision in the Supreme Court, I think that I'm going to be honest, I didn't like the decision. I don't think the decision is helpful to sort of what women are dealing with in this country. So, Rob, you are pro-life too, but Mark, you're pro-life. And so if you would allow me, this is now a state's issue, right? You're running for Congress. This is now a state issue moving forward. We know that the trigger law that North Dakota passed back in the 2007 legislature has exemptions for rape, incest, and protections of the mother. But Kristi Noem was on TV this weekend saying there shouldn't be those exemptions in South Dakota. As we're looking at red states that I don't think are going to overturn, and say that abortion can be legal, where do you stand on the exemptions? And if life truly begins at conception, how do you connect exemptions to sort of the will of God sort of thing? I think that these are, and we've talked about this is very complicated stuff. I think a lot of people look at the Supreme Court and say, all right, now abortion is done. Or people on the other side, it's so much more complicated than just legal versus not legal. So where do you stand on exemptions? If you believe in exemptions, how do you sort of justify that along with the belief that life begins at conception? How's that for a complicated question, Mark?
Thank you, Chad. It's a great question. You know what? I do believe that there should be 3 exceptions: rape, incest, and the life of the mother. Again, I have 36 years as a paramedic. I've been on some runs where there's been a spontaneous abortion and an ectopic pregnancy, and it's a very sad situation. But you focus on the life of the mother. You focus on airway, breathing, circulation, and you focus on keeping the mother alive. Whether she's aborted or not, that's the focus, and that's the focus of the medical community, keeping that mother alive as during that whole emergency. As my personal beliefs, yes, I believe life begins at conception. That is a preborn baby that the mother is carrying. That mother, it's a privilege. I believe I've read my Facebook posts out there, and no one's talking about the child. What are the rights of the child? They have a right to live. And I realize, Chad, you and I differ with that, and I respect that. I respect everybody's opinion on this issue, and it's a very, very emotional issue. There's very little compromise on this. As far as personally, getting back to the rape, incest, and life of the mother, again, my faith tells me just to have a deep examination of conscience. My conscience tells me this is where I'm at this time in my life. This is where I'm at with these 3 exceptions. But my conscience will not allow me to deviate from that. I believe wholeheartedly that this is a life inside a body that deserves to live. But I respect everyone's opinion on that. So thank you for letting me express that.
Mark, on that point, the chairman of the Democratic-NPL sent out, and this he sent this out back when all we had was the draft opinion from the Supreme Court back in May. And in the emailed statement, he called the draft, and obviously the end opinion wasn't all that different from the draft. He called it vile. He called it damning. He said that it will relegate women across the country as second-class citizens. He said this is evil. He said this is unconscionable. And I'm wondering, as a pro-life Democrat, how do you feel? I mean, I know you say you respect everybody, but a word like evil is it's tough to reconcile that. If somebody's saying that your position is evil, there's not a lot of room there. I'm wondering, as a candidate, who was endorsed by that party, was endorsed at the convention that Mr. Hart presided over, how do you feel when you hear those words?
Yeah, thank you, Chad. Thank you, Rob. You know what? Pat's a good friend of mine. This is a position that we differ. Roe v. Wade was not even on our radar. We're at this particular moment at this point in late June, at the convention in late March. I never hid my pro-life values, and Pat. So many people knew that I was pro-life, and I am pro-life. When that Saturday morning when I came to you, Rob, and said, Rob, I'm going to run for. I think you were one of the first persons I told. I'm going to run for this U.S. House because we just didn't have a lot of options. And so, the activists in the party, including Pat, they're pro-choice. The people that speak the loudest on the pro-choice camp. Do we have pro-lifers in the Democratic Party? Absolutely. Are we a minority? Absolutely. But that's democracy. And as far as the word evil, I'm not going to speak for Pat because he's a friend. And I don't think it's. But we're at a point where we're at. I have to work hard in just explaining my position. And explain the important other issues in this country, including the inflation, including access to health care, and focus on those. Okay, we have. If I could just pivot here for a second, we have annually there's 600 and some thousand abortions in this country annually. That's kind of what we know. That number may be much higher, according to some analysts out there. But we know abortions are probably going to go down now because of in North Dakota, we don't have access. Of course, we can cross the river into Moorhead. But in other states, it's going to be tougher. So abortions are probably going to go down. We don't know how much. But we got to be able to be prepared for this, from a mental health issue, from a child mother support issue. That's where the Democratic Party needs to stand up. Pat and I had a talk about this the other day in regards to, Mark, I like your whole life message. We don't agree on the abortion issue, but I love your whole life message of supporting mom and child and the family. And that's where the Democratic Party needs to shine and step up to the plate as much as the issue regarding pro-choice. And I'm going to speak plainly about that. I think that message will resonate as well, because abortions are going to go down, but we're going to need to support the family, support the mom much more than we have.
Honestly, just to interject, I think Republicans need to get on that train too, and we may disagree on what that support looks like or what the proper path is for it, but that's something Republicans need to be talking about too. If we're pro-life, it can't just be pro-life in the womb; it's got to be pro-life for all of life. So I agree with your whole life thing, although you and I might disagree on how to get there. Sorry, I cut you off, Chad.
No, that's fine. I think one of the things that we don't talk enough about, and Rob's written several columns this week about how Democrats are sort of split on the issue of abortion. I'm waiting for your Republicans or pro-choice 2 column.
Well, there are. The split's not quite as pronounced. And I was speaking to the partisanship. I mean, your party leaders out there calling this evil, and but for Democratic votes in the state Senate in 2007, North Dakota might not have a trigger abortion ban.
Understood, but any suggestion that there's only one party who has people on both sides of this issue is simply not
Absolutely
true.
Fair.
I think both of your points about the whole life thing is very, very important. One of my frustrations is when conservatives seem to think the only place government has in a child's life is between conception and birth, and then it's all hands off. There's nothing pro-life about that. There's nothing pro-life about not providing the services that are needed for our children and mothers. But these issues are also like super real life. Just this weekend, I've heard a story of an 11-year-old girl who was raped by her uncle and took the child to full term. And that when social services was in the home, the little girl said, "Hey, can I go out and play with my friends?" The mom said that. And so when we talk about these things, it's not just sort of a law in a books, but there's real people. I have a friend who was, 4 months pregnant, 6 months pregnant, tried a long time to get pregnant. And then the baby just wasn't going to make it. And she had two options: take the baby to full term, knowing perfectly well it wasn't going to be alive when it was born, and go through the months and months of people saying, "Aren't you so excited about your baby that's going to be born?" Or terminate that pregnancy. And when she went to terminate the pregnancy in another state, because it was past the end of it, there were protesters there yelling at her to save her baby. What she wanted more than anything was her baby to be saved. And so I think sometimes we talk about these things as if, these are the three exceptions, and we forget about those other cases. And I just have a fundamental issue with the government making that determination for my friend on how she should handle that situation, which is devastating for her. And should the government really make her take that, child to full term, knowing it's not going to be born and it's going to be mental anguish on her? And, and so I just think the humanity sometimes gets lost in these conversations. It's like, I don't want abortion. I don't want abortions, right? I don't want abortions. I adopted my child. We went through miscarriages. I know this, but I also fear for those mothers who are having miscarriages, who now, are they going to have law enforcement in their home saying, was the doctor involved in this miscarriage, or did it happen normally? So I think these things are so complicated, and we sometimes have policymakers who don't think about these things as being super complicated. There was no question there, Mark. That was just me on my soapbox for a little bit. But what would you say to that? I mean, I just think when we talk about the three exemptions, I think about my friend who was 4, 5, 6 months pregnant and wanted that child desperately. And this was a medical procedure. What would you say to that person?
Are you saying that she wanted to carry it to full term? Is that correct? Or what?
Well, the baby was not going to make it. I mean, it was determined the baby was not going to make it. It didn't. It wasn't like a stillbirth situation, but they knew the and so her options were to terminate the pregnancy or carry it for 9 months, knowing that the baby was going to die, and potentially painfully. I don't know. So my point overall, Mark, is there's just such unique circumstances here that we don't know all the answers from a policy perspective, and that's not unique to just abortion.
Right. And if I could just, it's hard for me to kind of look into that case. You experienced it obviously, and have expressed your feelings so well. Let's talk about prosecution here. I'm against prosecution. We need to step up with the mental health issues here, and the mental health issues it's going to create, and be there for the mom, the family. But going down the road of prosecuting the driver that's taking the person to the clinic,
right,
the doctor, I don't want to go down. No, I don't think hardly anybody wants to go down that road. Yes, there's some extremists that do, but we have some precedents here. And I thought about this, and I was listening to some of this debate. We have a stand your ground law in this country, or in the state now. We have a stand your ground law, and maybe this is not the greatest example, but we're not going to prosecute that individual for having killing that robber that comes into their door, and they feel their life is threatened, and they shoot that individual, and that robber or that perpetrator ends up dying. And that maybe not the greatest example, but we can go down and go down a road of compassion here, and love and understanding, and let's forget about prosecution.
Well, Mark, I appreciate your time on the show with us today and answering our questions. It's a tough issue. I can imagine when you decided that morning at the convention to jump into this race that you knew that between January 6th and the Supreme Court and everything, that it would be such a tumultuous year. But I guess that's what we all get. You want to be in the arena. This is what it is. So, Mark, I appreciate you coming on. and speaking so candidly with us.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Chad and Rob. It's been a great interview. You guys have a wonderful day.
We'll just finish up our conversation with Mark Haugen, running for U.S. House. And, one of the things is, as we were saying goodbye to Mark off air, is, I don't want the guy to become a piñata. Mark is such an honorable guy. And it's tough. Believe me, I know how tough it is to take a position that your party doesn't like. I remember being in favor of same-sex marriage on the blog, and I would get these comments, like literally 2,000, 3,000 comments under a post of people just railing on me because I was taking a position that was outside the orthodoxy of my ideology or my political movement. So that's a tough thing. That's a courageous thing to do. And Chad, I think principled stands like that. Obviously, maybe in this case you don't agree with Mark, but people who are willing to just kind of stick to their guns and not have their finger in the wind, I think we need more of that.
Yeah, I mean, here's what I do disagree with Mark on this. I knew from the beginning when he's ran for office in the past. I mean, he's made no secret of where he's at on this issue. I think it's much harder because he's running for Congress when this decision came down. So I think he's probably taking some heat from the left. Again, I disagree with him on this. I think that there's a lot of nuance to this issue. But what I do know about Mark and his family is their hearts are in the right place. And I think at the end of the day, his point about what Democrats need to focus on, because I think this is really an important discussion for us to have, what this abortion ban in North Dakota looks like. I trust that, I think that likely next session, there'll probably be bills brought forward to remove the exemptions that are in the trigger law around incest and rape and health of the mother.
Well, I wanted to get into that because it seems to me, because we have a lot of things that kind of overlap, because it's not just the 2007 trigger law. There's a 2019 law that I think is about like hospital admitting. There's the heartbeat ban that was enjoined by the courts. There's like two other laws. I was talking about them on the last episode with Attorney General Wrigley, who's obviously, his office is now in charge of unwinding some of that. One of the, now that he certified those two cases, his other things to go back into court on the other three cases, because that's his job, is to defend the laws of the state, is to go back and address those injunctions. Now, the thing is if all those laws, I mean, there's going to, I think at the very least, even from a pro-life perspective, there's going to need to be some cleanup. And one thing that we were kind of getting into in our discussion with Mark is, I think we're going to have, I mean, now that the courts have allowed states to make real actionable policy on this, there are some very important discussions to have. For instance, we talk all the time, we throw out, we'll have exceptions for rape, right? Okay. Does that mean that a pregnant mother has to wait until a rape has been prosecuted in court? Obviously, that's not practical. Those cases can take years.
It would have to be alleged rape.
Right.
Right?
So now can, I mean, but now what do you do? Does everybody who wants to have an abortion just say they were raped? That's, and what are we going to do about that? Right? Like, are we going to investigate and say, no, you can't? I mean, as a practical matter of law, how do we handle that? And I agree with Mark too. I'm not real interested in putting pregnant moms or I'm not real interested in putting doctors and moms in jail.
Rob,
I mean, debates about enforcement, debates about what the exceptions that we talk about all the time mean, and how they could even be enforced as a practical matter. These are real discussions that we're gonna have to have. But I will tell you, I am very glad that states are finally allowed to have these discussions. I hate that the courts took this issue away from the democratic process. I think it was a terrible mistake because it is complicated, but the courts settled it in just through fiat, just slammed down and denied us these debates. I'm glad we're going to have them.
Yeah, you and I disagree on that. I think it's unfortunate that a young woman in Fargo is going to have different rights than a young woman in Moorhead. I don't know that that's what I
But
want.
If you want there to be a right in the Constitution to abortion, then amend the Constitution.
Sure. And I think one of the things that's going to be interesting moving forward in the legislature, again, I think all those things that you talked about are going to have to be cleaned up and dealt with. We're losing a lot of really, really thoughtful people from the legislature, so I'm a little bit nervous about the quality of the expertise to really do this work. But the other thing is, your favorite thing in the world is the initiated measure. I know you just really enjoy that. I think we're going to start seeing in some of these states where abortion has been banned, that groups will look at initiating a measure to make it legal. And if you recall back in, was it 2014, the personhood ban that went down overwhelmingly. The legislature put it on the ballot and it lost 70-30.
I've seen that as a talking point that a lot of and saying, well, maybe we could overturn North Dakota's abortion ban that way. The dynamic that I think a lot of people are overlooking is that the biggest argument against that bill, like the one that was there was like a constitutional professor from UND who was getting just a ton of attention, was the idea that because of the Roe precedent and the Casey precedent, both of which have now been overturned by the Supreme Court, because of those things, it would just cost North Dakota a bunch of money and we'd lose in court.
Yeah,
and you got to remember
know.
in that context, there were some other, I think there were lawsuits over like the heartbeat bill, I think, and so in that context, you have to remember, like, the state of North Dakota had to pay out like several $100,000 to some of these law firms. That got a lot of attention. If Roe's off the table, that changes that political dynamic a lot.
Yeah, but it doesn't change the dynamic on things like in vitro fertilization. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with the eggs and discarding of eggs, if there's going to be legal ramifications of that. If that's now seen as a human being, you can't just throw the human being in a dumpster, right? And I'm assuming that's not what they do with fertilized eggs. I'm being sort of flippant on that, but I think it'd be an interesting campaign. Generally, I don't think people like to give up their rights and their individual freedoms. I would guess most people in North Dakota consider themselves pro-life, but I also think once you start digging into individual scenarios and you start thinking about this, I shouldn't say nobody. I'm sure there are people who are pro-abortion. I'm not. I think that we should be doing everything we can to limit people's
I'm much more interested in public policy that addresses unwanted pregnancy. I think that's I think that might be the most effective way in the world to reduce abortions, not just in states with abortion bans, but everywhere.
Rob, and I think we've talked about that in the past, and that's my biggest frustration with this thing, that there's just this idea that the court has decided now it's legal in some places, not legal in some. We need to be having conversations about contraception and comprehensive sex ed and all those things, because you're right. What's not usually aborted is if somebody doesn't have an unwanted pregnancy, there's not an abortion that's taking place. So what are we doing to reduce that? And the very same people, many of the very same people who want to overturn Roe also don't want comprehensive sex education or access to contraception.
That's a fair criticism. But again, I think the fact that we're allowed to have, I think the core, I think Roe did us such a, and I know you're going to disagree with this, I think Roe did this entire debate such a terrible disservice in that the courts just stepping in and settling it for us allowed, I think, both sides to sort of retreat to some very extreme positions on abortion, whether it's abortion on demand right up to the day of birth, or just total complete bans on abortion with no exceptions at all. It allowed everybody to retreat because none of it was ever going to become policy because the Supreme Court said it couldn't become policy. So I think, to me, that's the terrible disservice. It's going to be hard. This process is going to be terrible. It's going to be, the legislature is going to screw it up in some ways. I can just see it. And they should know, to your point about ballot measures, that the legislature doesn't act reasonably on this. Somebody may come along with a ballot measure and do it in a way that they don't like very much. So they need to be cognizant of that.
A ballot measure and a big ass checkbook. I think
we've seen you can buy your way onto the ballot, and you can buy your look at what they did with Marsy's law. You can buy your hobby horse into law.
But I think that the one place where you talking about this conversation at the states, I think that's really the crux of the issue, right? So you want to have this conversation at the states, and I think this is just a fundamental right of every person to be able to do that. So bringing it back to the states and having this argument. To me, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right that we're having a conversation about what I see as a fundamental right for folks going through these situations.
But I wonder, I mean, taking this out of the abortion issue, there's been so many, like the left has really hung its hat and has achieved so many victories through the courts. And I'm wondering now if there's going to be a lot of people on the left who are realizing, hey, maybe hanging our hats on the unappealable decisions of a bunch of law professors in robes isn't the right way to go about these things. Maybe we really do need to build a political consensus. Maybe we really do. And accept the fact that that's obviously an imperfect process. You're not going to win in every state.
Right. And I think that progressives, I mean, got absolutely killed by the Supreme Court in the last week. I mean, beyond abortion, you talk about the school prayer ruling. My phone just fell. There's a lot of things that I think progressives sort of have hung our hats on as sort of, okay, these are our rights because the court has determined that in the last week or so have lost those things. What is the football coach prayer thing? What does that mean for the separation of church and state moving forward? What does the main voucher money to private schools ruling mean? You just keep going down the list. And so I think your point is a good one. I mean, progressives can't count on the courts, much like maybe conservatives could in the past. I mean, you might have this flip of sort of where the power is played.
I hope conservatives don't follow progressives down that line where we think that because we have a conservative Supreme Court now, because they've been very effective even at appointing conservative judges down the ballot, that we don't look to courts as our primary avenue for policy victories. I think conservatives need to focus. We have to win through the political process, through the democratic process. That's where these things should be. I mean, to me, that's the conservative view on judicial matters. Courts shouldn't be deciding political questions. Courts should be applying the law that is established through the political process. That's the conservative point of view. And I worry, to your exact point, that there's going to be a flip-flop. Although I would point out that all the liberals who are upset now, who are screaming about how the court's invalid and everything else, that was conservatives back in the 1970s when Roe was first handed down. How you feel, that's how conservatives felt. And maybe there could be a little empathy there.
Yeah, and I go back to your earlier point of sort of the people on the left, trying to delegitimize. I don't want to let that. I mean, first of all, I don't think that's the right approach, but I also think comparing it to the insurrection is a little bit of good people on both sides.
That's for me because I don't think that it is. I think that if you can't accept that the election gave Joe Biden the presidency, that's not a lot of different than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying on Meet the Press that the Supreme Court, because it issued an opinion she didn't like, is invalid or whatever the term is that she used. She went down a list. She's like, oh, the Supreme they were appointed by a president who didn't win the national popular vote. Bill Clinton didn't win the national popular vote. He appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg and one other. Now I'm forgetting the other one.
So, Rob, I think my point here isn't necessarily that you can't connect these dots. I think AOC saying it on Meet the Press versus a bunch of people tearing down the Capitol and trying to hang Mike Pence, those are different.
It's a difference in scale. And let's not forget what's been going on at the private homes of some of these justices. Do you think that's appropriate? I don't.
Of course not. And I don't think that's appropriate. But with that being said, I mean, it's the conversation that we just had with Mark. I mean, sometimes when you're in the public eye, but it goes to the bigger point of you and I have been talking about this for 6 months. People just need to take a deep breath and sort of ratchet down the violence and whatever. I read your column about Mike Quinn and Kevin Kramer, the guy with the axe at Haugen's office. Those things are not acceptable either. But I also think that we all need to look in the mirror, and I think Kevin Kramer and John Hoeven in their participation in the Stop the Steal rally.
And Kelly Armstrong. I mean, Kelly. I consider Kelly my friend, but he was there, and I was critical of him for it. Why? What are you doing there?
Yeah, and I think that, but we need to look at that full circle. I mean, again, should Mike Quinn be calling and threatening Kevin Kramer? Hell no, that is unacceptable. But we all need to just sort of calm it down.
I agree. I agree with that across the board. And again, I think that if we could calm it down and if we could stop treating, like if pro-life people could stop treating the people who are concerned about 15-year-olds having babies, try to stop treating them like murderers, and if people on the left could stop treating everybody who's pro-life as you know how many times I've been called a Bible thumper in the last week or so? I'm not even Christian. I can't even remember the last time I've been to church. I'm not religious at all. I'm an atheist. But my convictions are what they are based on my analysis of the facts. I think if we cooled all that down, we could create probably some really good policy at the state level. And maybe it's not to everybody's liking, but I think we could find a way to find some common ground on some of these things.
Again, though, Rob, I think when people feel like they're losing their fundamental rights to their own body and their own choices, it's hard to find that middle ground.
Right,
and
but that gets back to my point. If you want it to be a right, there's a political process for that. You can amend the state constitution. You can amend the national constitution.
And I think it's important that we recognize the hurt and the anger that people are feeling. I mean, there are a lot of women that are feeling like lesser than citizens after this ruling. Like they don't have I think we also should be having conversations about if life begins at conception, then child support should start at conception, right? I mean, people like you and I, Rob, Ben, have a role in this. I mean, I don't know of many babies.
I do like how all of a sudden men have a voice. Like I feel like that's the left maybe realizing that telling men to shut up about this issue maybe wasn't the greatest political strategy, because the day after the Supreme Court handed that opinion down, I'm reading articles in the New York Times that all of a sudden care about how men feel about abortion. When all the time you don't have a uterus, shut up. Like that was a crap political strategy.
Well, and I don't know that it's as much you don't have a uterus, so shut up. It's just that we know with
Have you seen some of the signs at these rallies? Because that was literally the argument.
But I think conversations around the fact that, I mean, a woman gets pregnant, a man who's a deadbeat doesn't have to do anything until that baby is born, right? And so if we're forcing the birth to take place, I mean, again, the man has a very significant role in creating this child. And if we're forcing this child to be born and all the repercussions to a woman's body, to the economics of those 9 months and whatever, all right, boys, let's step up.
Yeah. I think people, if you looked up the records, and I did a while ago, I don't remember, but men are not, more routinely than you would think put in jail for not paying their child support. So the idea that men were just completely off the hook for that is not true. I mean, there's economic implications there.
Are they paying child support for the first 9, like before the baby is born?
No, just the 18 years after. But and the thing is, I'm agreeing with you. I think you're right. I think if we're gonna say that life begins at conception, then maybe dad needs to be on the hook 9 months earlier in the process, or whenever they find out. I don't know. I mean, I'd be willing to have a debate about that, because I do believe that life begins at conception. And that's always been the thing that I've struggled with, is this idea that the life and I was just talking about this with my wife, that the idea that the life in the womb either exists or doesn't exist based on whether or not it's wanted. I struggle with that mightily. And I think if Mark was still on, he would probably say that's one of the reasons he does too. That's not rational to me.
And Mark didn't really respond to this question, but I struggle with the conservative view of being okay with exemptions, but it's God's will that this baby is being born. I mean,
me personally, it's not a God's will thing. I mean, to me, that's a pragmatic thing.
But there are many people who believe that. I mean,
sure,
that it's God's will. So, and I was shocked to see Kristi Noem this weekend talking about there shouldn't be exemptions. I mean, that's not you and I have talked about this. Abortion until 9 months is not a popular position, but also no abortion with no exemptions is not a popular position. We're all in the middle.
If you look at and that's the thing that's always like, are you pro-choice or you're pro-life? The consensus view of Americans is that there should be a ban on abortions after about 15 to 20 weeks, with exemptions for rape, incest, health of the mother. That's the consensus view. Is that a pro-life view or a pro-choice view? Right?
Yeah.
Because if you ask the extremists, they're gonna have, and that's the thing. That's generally and obviously that's gonna vary depending on which part of the country you're polling. But I mean, I think, again, I'm glad that this has been turned over to the political process because, again, we can have those debates, right? We can say, okay, a compromise is abortion after 15 weeks is illegal with these exceptions. Like, we could have that compromise and it would be a lot easier, but for the fact that the court stepped in. Now maybe we will. I don't know. We're going to see. We're going to find out.
So I think, the human element of this is obviously important, and you and I disagree on sort of if this is good or bad. But I think there are political ramifications, and you start looking at the swing voters in suburban areas, and what does this mean for congressional races moving forward?
Well, let's talk about that. The midterms are coming up. Prior to, to this point, the idea, I think that the consensus is the wind's at the back of the Republicans, and that they're going to have a pretty good midterms. Do you think this changes that?
I think it changes it some. I think that the gun ruling, the gun bill passing, I think Mitch McConnell made no bones about it. He was trying to inoculate Republicans from suburban women leaving the party for this November. But then this abortion thing, I think, swings women in those areas back. I don't know if it's going to be enough. I also think this January 6th stuff, yesterday's hearing, I think was a bit of a game changer in terms of, again, it's not even like we're necessarily hearing new information, but some of the stuff about Trump's behavior is just simply not presidential. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised, but everything Mark Meadows knowing, I feel like
it doesn't surprise me that Donald Trump throws his hamburger against the wall or his plate of food against the wall when he's upset, or that he's screaming obscenities at his staff. That doesn't surprise me at all. But to hear it viscerally from somebody who was a loyal person, and that's the thing that the Trump loyalists out there, we can switch to this topic a little bit. They're always talking about how everybody they're just Trump haters, right? But you have Bill Barr, who not exactly a profile in courage, but when he was put under oath was saying, he acknowledged and certainly was talking internally that the president's ideas about a stolen election were bunk. It was, the list of like cabinet level and administration officials who have turned on Donald Trump is very, very long. And so it becomes a point at which, so they're all scummy people, scum of the earth people. Well, who hired them all?
Yep. Well, and the other thing at play here, the folks like our congressional delegation isn't going to turn on Trump unless the Republican voters in the state decide to turn on Trump. So that's the real. Are these hearings influencing anybody at the grassroots? I question that, and I also question if people have the capacity if there's prosecution. And I sort of go back and forth on if there should be prosecution. I heard somebody once say that the worst thing that the only thing worse than not prosecuting Trump would be to prosecute, or vice versa.
The one thing I'm worried about is as much as I think Trump richly deserves it, do we want to open the door to prosecuting presidents?
Well, and does it create a civil war situation in this country? That's the other thing that scares the hell out of me. Nobody's above the law. But
it kind of gets back in, and obviously, Richard Nixon's manifest sins look positively pedestrian compared to Donald Trump. But there's a reason why Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, right?
Yeah.
And I think the reason why is to avoid some of the things that we're talking about. Like, I don't want to open the door to political prosecutions of presidents, to where that's what they do in like banana republics, right? That's what they do in these tin-part, where somebody falls out of favor, or you get the right majority in Congress, and now all of a sudden, there were people who used to call George W. Bush a war criminal and everything else.
So your fear is that people will use this for future presidents to prosecute them?
I worry once you open the door, we're going to start lowering the bar, and every president's going to end up getting indicted. That's what I worry about.
What would be ideal is if just Trump just went away. Right? If just Trump went away, I think it's
went away. Buy yourself a nice island somewhere and go live on it and leave us alone. That's what I want.
Hear from it. It would be good for the Republican Party.
Live a long, healthy life. Live a long, healthy life with your children. Be happy. Do what you want to do. Cheat on your wife. Whatever it is you're going to do, Donald Trump. Go do that and leave us alone.
Yeah. Literally, there's no better scenario for the Republican Party than that, because what happens leading up to 2024 if Trump gets in and DeSantis runs or whatever? I mean, that's just going to be a disaster for the Republican Party.
I would like to think that you would see an exodus. You would see people who just aren't going to vote for him, and deny him the election. Although on the other hand, I mean, God, what happens if Joe Biden runs for another term? I mean, that's not such a great. And I don't want to put Joe Biden in John. I don't like Joe Biden. I don't like his policies. Yeah. I think it was a mistake to elect him as president, except that the alternative was Donald Trump. But I mean, Joe Biden is not a great leader for our country right now either.
So I like Joe Biden, and I'm not in the business of taking any shots at Joe Biden. I think that going into 2024, the age thing should be a concern for Democrats. And, I do think that if Trump is the GOP nominee, we have to give Republicans something to vote for on the left. And I'm not sure that Biden creates that at this point. But stuff can change so rapidly. Things are going to change before November, let alone November of 2024, in terms of what things look like.
One thing that bothered me, the one thing I didn't like about the abortion, even though I think it was the right as a legal question, and I think it's unfortunate everybody is seeing the Supreme Court's decision through the lens of whether or not they think abortion should be legal. I think Brett Kavanaugh laid it out perfectly. The Constitution is neutral on the question of abortion. If you don't want it to be neutral, then amend the Constitution. But it's neutral on the question. To me, that's the right legal decision, whatever your opinion is about abortion. But that's one thing that's really bothered me, is that Trump's going to get a lot of credit from Republicans, from the pro-life movement. Already is getting a lot of credit. I mean, he was out taking a victory lap on it. He's going to get credit on this issue, and I worry about what that means for his enduring popularity.
Yeah, and speaking of Kavanaugh and some of these other justices who said, basically said they're not going to overturn Roe, and I know
they
that
didn't
you
say
said
that. They never said. No, they didn't.
Yeah. Precedent, and I know that you told me in the
past.
It
is. You can recognize something as important precedent. I can recognize that a law I don't like is the law of the land, and still think that law should be overturned.
So do you think we should just get rid of the hearings? I mean, it seems to me like something needs to be changed with how we vet Supreme Court justices. I mean, at some point, if somebody is qualified academically or whatever, maybe to the victor goes the spoils. But I think the circus around those hearings and the senators using them for, it's what you've talked about. What's good about the January 6th thing is that they're not doing what happens at Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Hearings.
Although I the one thing I will worry a little bit about this last, God, why am I forgetting her name now? But the aide who just testified,
Cassidy Hutchinson.
The one thing I worry about is she said the thing about about Trump grabbing the steering wheel of the Supreme Court, and she testified to that, but she heard it secondhand, and now you're hearing some rumblings that the Secret Service might be out going to dispute that. And I really worry, because if she heard it secondhand and whoever told it to her didn't tell her the truth or something, that doesn't really speak to her credibility. But I kind of feel like she should, if she didn't witness it herself, she shouldn't have brought it in, because now everybody who wants to dismiss what she said can hang their hat on that if it gets disputed.
Yeah, I was watching some talking heads last night, and they were discussing if the president could actually reach the steering wheel from the back seat.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Was he riding shotgun?
If you just left that part out of the testimony, you still had a lot of gold there. And so I worry that we're now going to get caught up on those semantics about, did he really grab the wheel?
See, that's what I worry, because I think the rest of her testimony was credible and powerful, and I worry that she might have had a self-inflicted wound with that one. We got a couple of minutes left. Let me ask you this. What do you think, and I don't know that it's necessarily going to be a factor this cycle, but going forward, what does this decision mean for Republicans in North Dakota in terms of holding on? I think that this may be an opportunity for Democrats. And the reason why I say that is because although North Dakotans, if Democrats can moderate their position on abortion as well, right? Because abortion has been this issue where you could just kind of say, yeah, I'm pro-life, yeah, I'll vote for these things, and it didn't matter because everything was going to get overturned because of Roe. That's not the case anymore. So now if you're talking about abortion policy, you have to answer some very pertinent questions about it. Like some of the things we were just talking, what does an exception for rape mean as a practical matter? And I think there's an opportunity, if Democrats can moderate their position a little bit and not call it evil and everything else, that there may be some opportunities to put Republicans on the spot saying, no, this is real world policy that's going to impact real people now. We have to talk about that. I think it's going to be a very, very profound impact on some of these races across the state.
Rob, I hate to be the guy who has little faith in the voters of North Dakota, because that's generally your role here. But the conversations we've had since the primary about, people voted just on the transgender bill or whatever, I don't know that voters have the time or energy to look at that level of nuance. And as long as the national parties still sort of are fringy, not even fringy, just, maybe don't have the best messaging to connect Republicans in blue states and vice versa, I don't think it's going to matter a whole heck of a lot in terms of the ballot box.
Well, I guess we're going to find out, but I don't know. It'll have to be, I think, probably a few cycles from now. You and I can have a show reminiscing about this conversation and which of us was right. Although I do think it's interesting that I am taking the pro-democracy position on this one, saying that it should be. Because as much as I very much believe in the idea that democracy is the best form of government except for all the others. And I'm not a big fan of direct democracy. I'm not a big fan of majoritarianism. But I do think that we're better off when these issues, as emotional as we all are about them, I think we're better off when these issues are settled through the political process rather than judicial fiat.
And who would have thought I'd be taking the position that human beings have basic civil rights that should not be in the political arena to decide if people should have those rights or not?
Although, again, every right that we exercise is in the Constitution and was created through the political process. If you want to add to that list, you can avail yourself of the political process to do that. And the fact that it's hard is not an excuse. But we're going to end it right there. Chad, thanks for your time as always.
Rob, I would like to say it's been fun, but I don't know any time we spend an hour talking about abortion is fun.
It is the least fun issue in the world. And I think for both of us, I think if you're having fun talking about abortion, you're kind of a horrible person because it is so personal and so consequential. Like to your point, there are real lives involved in this, and none of us should be glib about it. None of us should be unnuanced about it. So it's not fun to talk about, but hey, that's what democracy I think requires of us. You have to have these conversations. This is what our type of society, if we just wanted to let dictators tell us how everything's going to be, then I guess we could avoid it. But that's not self-governance. These sorts of conversations are what it means. So as always, Chad, thanks for your time. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.